Welcome back, everyone. I am Breakup Brad. And in today's video, I'm going to walk you through the 6 stages that your ex will go through after a breakup. Now, before we get started, let me quickly explain why this is such an important topic. And that is because if you want your ex back, then you can't just think about your own feelings. You also need to understand really what's happening inside your ex's head after the relationship ends. Because depending on which stage your ex is in, the way you respond or don't respond can really make the difference between reconnecting or pushing them away forever. And yes, I know this is a subject that other breakup coaches have touched on, but I've been doing this for nearly 15 years now, and I've noticed there are a few stages that often get overlooked. These are key psychological shifts that really nearly every ex goes through, at least in one way or another. And when you actually understand these stages, then you're going to have a clear roadmap for how to handle things and get them back. All right, just quickly before we begin, keep one thing in mind, and that is not every breakup is identical. And really, not every person will move through these stages that I'm going to talk about in the exact same order or at the exact same pace. But in general, the majority of people will follow this pattern pretty closely. Now, the one exception is if your ex has an avoidant attachment style. If you are certain that your ex is an avoidant, then you should go and watch my other video on this exact same topic that I made specifically for avoidant exes by clicking the pop-up here or the link in the description below. But if you know that your ex isn't avoidant or you're not sure what their attachment style is, then keep watching. All right, now let's start by diving into stage 1. So interestingly, the first stage that your ex goes through usually happens before the breakup itself. And that might sound strange, but here's what I mean. Long before you hear the words, "I think we should break up," your ex has already been wrestling with the decision. On some level, they've already accepted that ending the relationship is the path that they need to take. Now, that doesn't mean that they're happy about it. In fact, this stage is usually full of inner conflict. They may go back and forth in their mind for weeks or even months, just trying to decide whether to stay in the relationship or leave. And during that time, you probably noticed that your ex's emotions were swinging all over the place. One day they're distant and irritable. The next day they're unusually affectionate. And then suddenly they're picking fights again. And that roller coaster behavior is often a direct reflection of that internal struggle that they're going through. They know that they're leaning towards ending things, but they can't admit it to you yet because that would force them to actually face it head on before they're really ready. Think of it like someone standing at the edge of a cold swimming pool. They know they're about to jump in. They know it's going to be uncomfortable at first, but they're trying to build up the courage. And that's roughly what the acceptance stage feels like for your ex. They've already made that decision deep down, but they're trying to mentally prepare themselves for the plunge. So why does this stage matter if it happens before the breakup and it's already over probably by the time you're watching this video? Well, because elements of stage 1 often resurface later on. So your ex's uncertainty, guilt, and those emotional swings in the early stages of the breakup, those often echo again later, especially when they begin doubting whether they've really made the right choice. So if you can look back and recognize how your ex was behaving before the breakup, those mood swings, the avoidance, the distance, that gives you some clues about how they might act in some of the later stages. So stage 1 is all about them quietly accepting that the relationship is ending, even while you are still in the dark. Now, it's not fun to realize this, but it is important groundwork to understand what comes next. And once the breakup does actually happen, that brings us to stage 2. So once the breakup finally happens, then your ex will almost always experience an initial sense of relief. And I know that may sting to hear, but it's a very normal psychological response, and it doesn't mean anything for your chances of getting them back. Think about it like this. Imagine you've been carrying around a heavy backpack all day long. At first, it's going to be uncomfortable, and then as time goes on, you get used to the weight. But the second you take that backpack off your shoulders, you suddenly realize just how much strain you were under. That moment of release, it feels like freedom. So for your ex, the backpack was that stress of anticipating the breakup and the guilt of knowing that they were about to hurt you. The longer they cared about you, the heavier that emotional burden became. So when they finally actually went through with the breakup, when they said those words, when they packed up their things and walked out the door, they get to set that weight down. And the immediate sensation for them is relief. Now, don't misinterpret this, because the relief is not because you were a burden to your ex or because the relationship was meaningless. It's not that simple. The relief comes from from no longer having to wrestle with the decision, no longer having to live with the dread of causing you pain. It's the stress of the decision itself that gets lifted, not the stress of actually just being with you. So think back to a time that you had to deliver some really bad news to somebody that you cared about. Maybe you had to fire an employee or admit something difficult to a close friend. And before you said it to them, you probably felt sick with anxiety. But the moment those words were out, even though you knew it would hurt this person, there was that strange wave of relief. The worst part, the moment of actually doing it, was behind you. And that's exactly what happens for your ex in this stage. And that relief, typically shows up as what I like to call false happiness. So your ex, they may act like they're thriving. Maybe they start posting smiling photos on social media, going out with their friends all the time, partying, maybe even diving into a rebound relationship. And to you, watching from the outside, it can look like they're celebrating being free of you. But in reality, what you're actually seeing is that rush of relief combined with a temporary distraction from guilt. They're not actually better off without you. They're just chasing ways to amplify the high of no longer feeling torn in two. But here's the key. This stage is temporary. Relief doesn't last. It usually fades within a few weeks, sometimes a couple of months at most, depending really on how long the relationship lasted and how emotionally invested your ex was. And here's another thing. Relief almost always comes with guilt attached. They know they hurt you, and they know they're feeling better while you're probably suffering. And that guilt lingers, and it will creep back into their mind as they move into the later stages. So while it may look like your ex is living their best life right now after the breakup, don't be fooled. They're in the relief bubble. And when that bubble bursts, the harder emotions are going to start to hit them. So once the initial relief begins to wear off, something interesting happens. Your ex starts to feel curious. And this is the intrigue stage. See, when your ex ended things, they probably assumed that they knew exactly how you'd react. In their mind, they expected you to chase after them, to beg them for another chance, to linger around as a friend, or to constantly check in with them. Why did they expect that? Well, because in most cases, that's exactly what does happen. The person who was dumped, desperately tries to hold on. And let's be honest, your ex probably walked away with a certain level of ego boost. They knew you loved them. They knew the relationship had a lot of good in it. And because they were the one to call it off, they subconsciously reassured themselves, if I ever change my mind, I can always go back. I have options. And that's where the intrigue comes in. Now, if you follow my advice and you actually resist the urge to contact them, if you don't beg, you don't plead, and you don't offer yourself up as their emotional safety net, then suddenly their expectations are shattered. Instead of being showered with attention and validation, they're met with silence. No calls or texts, no constant reminders of your love. And that creates a kind of cognitive dissonance for them. We're wired to look for patterns. So when something plays out the way we expect, we can relax and move on. But when the pattern, is broken, it nags at us. It leaves us feeling unsettled. And that is cognitive dissonance. So if your ex expected you to chase and instead you just vanish into silence, that creates an unanswered question in their mind. Wait, why aren't they reacting the way I thought they would? Do they not care anymore? Did they already move on? And that uncertainty is seriously powerful, and it drives curiosity. Now, how does that curiosity usually show up? Well, in today's world, really, it often starts on social media. So maybe they start watching your Instagram stories, liking your posts, just to see what you're up to. Or maybe they start asking mutual friends about you, how you're doing, what you've been saying, whether you've mentioned them. And sometimes they'll even reach out to you directly. You might get a casual text like, hey, how are you? Or a comment on something that you've posted on social media. But don't be fooled, because these aren't genuine attempts to actually rekindle the relationship. They're just tests. They want to see if you'll bite. And here's the critical part. If you immediately respond, if you pour out your feelings or you reassure your ex that you still want them back, you've just given them the closure that they were looking for. You've confirmed their ego boost, that you're still waiting in the wings. But if you hold back, if you ignore those first couple of breadcrumbs or keep your responses short and unemotional, then you deny them that validation. And that keeps them in a state of mental tension. Think of it like a cliffhanger at the end of a TV show episode, right? The unanswered question keeps the viewer hooked. They can't stop thinking about it. And the more they think about you, the more your ex thinks about you, the more, of course, they're going to start to miss you. So really, the intrigue stage is all about your ex realizing they don't actually have as much control over the situation as they thought. You've created a mystery that they feel compelled to solve. And that mystery draws them back into your orbit. even if they don't really consciously realize it yet. Now, handled properly, this stage sets the foundation for what comes next. A much more emotional, much more vulnerable stage where your ex starts to worry that they may be losing you for good. So if you're sitting there right now thinking to yourself, how do I know what stage my ex is in? Or if you're worried that, it might already be too late for you and there might no longer be really any hope, well, before you give up, take a few minutes and complete my free quiz at breakupbrad.com/quiz. It'll analyze your answers and it'll give you a score out of 100, breaking down your chances, as well as offering some personalized suggested next steps based on your specific situation. Again, you can take the quiz for free at breakupbrad.com/quiz. Now, on to that next stage. All right, now we've reached what I consider to be one of the most critical turning points in your ex's breakup journey, and that is the fear stage. So here's the truth. Until your ex actually begins to worry that they might lose you forever, they have no real incentive to come back. Curiosity alone isn't enough. Relief certainly isn't enough. They need that little spark of fear, the fear that they've made a mistake that can't be undone. And this stage usually comes directly after intrigue. Remember, in stage 3, your ex is curious about what you're up to. They're unsettled because you didn't react the way they expected. And at first, that curiosity feels manageable to them. But as the silence continues, it starts to morph into anxiety. They begin to realize, wait a second, maybe I don't actually have as much power over this situation as I thought. Maybe they're not sitting around waiting for me. Maybe they really are moving on. And this is exactly where the worry begins to set in. Think about it from your ex's perspective. For weeks, maybe months, they told themselves that if they ever wanted you back, they could just snap their fingers and you'd come running. And that belief gave them a sense of safety, even after ending the relationship. But once you've been consistently distant, once you've refused to feed into their little tests or desperate attempts at validation, suddenly that safety net looks a lot less secure. And that is when the panic begins. Now, I often compare this to the way we treat the sun. So imagine your love as sunlight and your ex as a houseplant. For the entire relationship, you were the reliable source of warmth and energy that helped them to thrive. And when the breakup happened, it was like winter arrived. The days got shorter, the light got weaker, but the sun was still there in some form. But now in stage 4, it's as though the sun has just completely disappeared behind the clouds. Suddenly that plant starts reaching toward the window, straining for really any trace of light it can get. And that's really exactly what your ex begins to do here. They lean towards you. They want reassurance. They want contact. They want to feel the comfort of your presence again. But, and this is really important, they're not reaching out for the right reasons yet. At this point, it's not about rebuilding the relationship or fixing the problems that caused the breakup. It's about self-preservation. Your ex is just worried about losing their safety net. They're worried about losing you, yes, but more so about losing the option of you. So how does this usually play out in the real world? Well, often you're going to notice more consistent attempts at contact. The occasional breadcrumb from stage 3 becomes, more frequent texts, more phone calls, more social media interactions. They might even suggest you get together, just to talk. And sometimes, the worry can come out as frustration or even anger. They may ask, why are you ignoring me? What did I do to deserve this? And that's because they're unsettled and they're trying to regain that control. Now, here's where many people make a fatal mistake. When they see their ex start to panic, when they finally start getting those calls or texts, they rush to respond. They pour their heart out, they reassure their ex that they still care, and they give in to that emotional pressure. And what happens? Well, their ex feels reassured. That fear they were feeling goes away. And suddenly they're right back into stage 2, relief. They think, okay, good. I didn't really lose them. They're still there if I want them. And just like that, all the progress you've made is undone. And that's why in stage 4, the best thing you can do is just hold your ground. Yes, your ex is probably going to show signs of missing you. Yes, they're starting to lean in your direction again, but they're not doing it with the right mindset. You need them to feel that worry a little bit longer. You need them to truly believe that losing you is a real possibility. It's uncomfortable, I know, but it's also the turning point that shifts them from fear of loss into doubt about their decision. And that is exactly where you want them next. Because when the worry deepens into genuine reflection, then your ex will begin questioning whether breaking up with you was actually the right move. And that brings us to stage 5. So by the time your ex reaches stage 5, the emotional landscape is going to look very different than it did right after the breakup. The relief that they once felt is gone. The curiosity has turned into anxiety. And the fear of losing you has started to really sink in. And now they begin asking themselves the question that really matters. Did I make a mistake? And this is the stage where your ex starts to seriously second guess their decision. Up until now, most of what they've been feeling has been reactive. Relief at finally ending things, curiosity about your silence, worry that you might be slipping away. But in stage 5, those feelings begin to transform into deeper reflection. They start analyzing, comparing, and wondering if they gave up on something that they should have held on to. Now, there's plenty of triggers that can really push your ex into this mindset. Sometimes it's just the realization that single life isn't as exciting as they expected. Other times, it's when a rebound relationship fails to live up to expectations. And often it's just simply the passage of time, because the longer you're apart, the more their memory softens. Remember, humans, we tend to filter the past, letting the bad moments fade away and clinging onto the good memories. So that means your ex is more likely to remember the laughter, the support, the closeness you shared, while minimizing the thoughts of those conflicts that probably led to the breakup. And as those positive memories grow louder, then the doubts start to creep in. Did I just walk away from the best thing I ever had? What if I can't find someone else who understands me like they did? Did I give up too easily? And those questions start looping in their mind, and it usually unsettles them in a very different way than before. Because when your ex is in this stage, you're often going to notice their behavior shifting. Unlike the half-hearted breadcrumbs of stage 3 or those panic texts of stage 4, their outreach begins to feel more emotional. Instead of a quick, hey, or how are you, they might start sending messages that carry more weight. Like, I was thinking about you today, or I missed the way we used to do X. They may even suggest meeting up for a real conversation. And the tone is going to be different too. They'll often sound more careful with their words, more respectful, sometimes even apologetic. And that's because they're no longer assuming that you'll be there waiting. For the first time, they're starting to feel like they might actually need to win you back. And this is the point where your approach needs to shift as well. Because earlier on, it was all about keeping your distance. Keeping your distance was critical. But once your ex is in stage 5, then you can begin to engage more, slowly and cautiously. If they reach out, at this point, it's okay to respond warmly, but you don't want to overdo it. The goal is to show that you're open to reconnecting, but only under the right circumstances. It is really important that you do hold on to your self-respect here. Don't rush to reassure your ex or make promises. Let them do some of the work. Let them prove through their actions that they're not just acting out of loneliness or fear, but because they genuinely want to rebuild something meaningful with you. Now, handled properly, stage 5 is often where real reconciliation begins. Many of my coaching clients reunite with their ex during this stage 5 because the emotions finally line up in the right way. But if it is mishandled, if you chase too hard, if you push them away completely, then your ex will eventually move into that final stage. And that last stage is when you need to understand clearly, and that is regret. So, like I said, the final stage in your ex's journey is regret. Now, this is the point where they finally realize that they might have lost you for good. And the weight of that realization starts to sink in. Unlike the doubt stage where there's still hope and curiosity driving their actions, regret feels heavier, more permanent. It's the sinking feeling that they threw away something truly valuable and there's no easy way back. Now, at this stage, your ex will, often replay the relationship in their mind with a sense of finality. Instead of wondering whether they made the right choice, they start to believe that they made the wrong one. The hope of reconciliation begins to fade, replaced by that hollow, pit of the stomach ache that comes with realizing that an opportunity has truly slipped away. And regret is painful because it doesn't leave much room for action. In stage 5, doubt often motivates your ex to reach out, to test the waters, to see if there's still a chance. But in stage 6, many exes just stop trying. They may withdraw, they may go quiet. They may even begin acting bitter or resentful. And that's not because they don't care. It's because the loss has damaged their confidence. When people feel like they've truly missed their shot, they often protect themselves by just shutting down or redirecting their emotions into frustration. Now, for you, from your perspective, this stage can be the hardest to watch. You may sense that your ex is sad, that they're hurting, that deep down they wish they could undo their decision. But because they believe it's too late, they don't make an effort to rebuild. The window of opportunity really feels closed. And unless something changes, they'll eventually try to move on. carrying that regret with them. Now, it is important to remember that not every breakup will reach stage 6. Like I said earlier, many of my clients do get their ex back earlier, often in stage 5, when the doubt is fresh and the possibility of reconciliation actually still feels alive. But when things do progress to regret, it becomes quite a bit harder to turn the tide. And that's why patience and strategy in the earlier stages really matter so much, because the way you handle yourself after the breakup can be the difference between your ex feeling regret too late or realizing their mistake while there's still time to repair things. So where does this leave you? Well, ultimately, your ex's emotional state is the key to everything. Their journey through these 6 stages, acceptance, relief, intrigue, fear, doubt, and regret, is the roadmap to understanding when and how they're going to come back. And if you can recognize which stage they're in, you'll know whether to keep your distance, to hold firm, or to begin opening that door again. And that awareness gives you a huge advantage. Now, if you feel like your ex is maybe stuck in one of these stages and you're not sure how to handle it or how to guide things forward, that's exactly where my one-on-one coaching program can help. Visit breakupbrad.com/coaching to learn more, and we can work together on a custom plan tailored to your specific situation. Again, just go to breakupbrad.com/coaching, learn about how my coaching program works, and get started working with me today while you still have time. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more free breakup advice, and I will see you in the next one.